Euroopa ajaloos me tunneme perioode, kus on olnud piiratud huvidega riigid ja riigid, kes moodustasid Euroopa kontserti. Ja järgmise paneeli teema ongi Väikeriik kui võrdne partner. Ma kutsuksin siia välispoliitika eksperdi ja Postimehe ajakirjaniku Evelin Kaldoja.
Okay. I think I should start in English then, because most of my panelists would understand that. As the moderator already said, the topic would be small states as equal partners, and our panel has been described by two aspects. One of them is the issue of how can small states efficiently make themselves heard. The other aspect would be to what extent does current international state of matters threaten small countries and their voices? And for that, I will invite to the panel 4 diplomats. One of them fortunately retired, so I hope he will be more open, and it has even been promised that he's known in his homeland as a provocateur, Mr. Pasi Padokalja, who's currently titled as the Foreign Policy and Arms Control Expert, please. He's from Finland, as I think majority would understand from his name. Take a seat. And then secondly, Jens Ole Bach-Hansen, who's currently titled as the promoter of UN Sustainable Development Goals, but also has experience at the UN headquarters, please. Then Mrs. Raimonda Murmakaite, who's currently Director of Transatlantic Cooperation Security Policy Development at Lithuanian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but also has experience as Lithuanian ambassador to United Nations during their membership of United Nations Security Council. And then Paul Teesalu, who's the Deputy Undersecretary for Political Affairs at Estonian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Okay, now it works. And for a start, I would like each one of you tell a bit about yourself, and also maybe a story from your own career where you could feel that you made your country matter, your small country, because all of our countries are quite small, and they, I think, also understand they are small. And maybe, I don't know, maybe Pasi would start.
Well, thank you, Evelyn, and good morning, Estonia, and congratulations on your centennial as an independent state. Of course, Finland and Estonia are very close neighbors, but I think we could still be a bit closer. I was flying in from Helsinki yesterday here, and I kept thinking that we really should build that railway tunnel under the Gulf of Finland and put the two capital cities closer together, you know, make it a Helsinki or a Hellin or something like that. But anyway, as to the subject at hand, well, I thought that I might, not a provocateur, I mean, for some reason the moderator felt that way. I expect you to be. Yeah. Anyway, I'm going to talk about something which is perhaps surprises a little bit. I'm going to talk about anti-personnel landmines, APLs for short. I led our delegation to all the negotiations in the latter half of the 90s that led to the eventual conclusion of the Ottawa Convention, banning all anti-personnel landmines. For us, of course, we understood full well the humanitarian concerns that were involved with landmines, but we had to also be mindful of our own human rights, our own security. The problem, if you recall, was mostly in the third world, mostly the irresponsible and indiscriminate use of these weapons in conflicts there. We hadn't contributed to that as a country. We've never exported a single APL. And actually we were contributing to mine clearance, still are. Pretty penny in that regard. So we were in a dilemma, because for us, these anti-personnel landmines, which are known as anti-infantry mines actually in Finland, were an important defensive weapon. And getting rid of them was certainly not an easy matter at all. All our mines, landmines, these APLs, were in storage, well guarded by soldiers. There was no chance of any civilians stepping on a mine, and we didn't have, contrary to what some people believed, we didn't have minefields on our eastern border. They were all in storage. So that was the situation. Well, to cut a long story short, still have a bit of time. We were not able to join the Ottawa Convention at the outset. We joined only 12 years later. And now I'm getting to your point about making a difference. The delay, the 12 years, made a huge difference to us in terms of giving us time, 12 years, to prepare for the situation where we wouldn't have any more of these defensive weapons. So we had time to replace them with other defensive means, unfortunately much more expensive than the cheap ones we had. So that's my take on your question as to where a small country could make a difference. We certainly made a difference to ourselves, and I'm proud that I was part of that effort. Thank you.
Well, for a small country, itself is the main customer. So it's okay. Maybe Jens, would you continue your example of how did you, of a situation where you really felt that Denmark and you yourself made a difference?
Thank you, and thank you also to Estonia and the Institute for Human Rights for inviting me today. It's an honor for a Dane to come to Estonia, a country that has recently experienced not benefiting from human rights, to talk about human rights. There's also a strong link between our two countries. Next year we will celebrate, together with the Danish embassy, that it's 800 years since, according to the myth, the Danish flag fell from the sky here.
It's pure truth.
That was in troubled times between our two countries. Today, fortunately, our relationship is really, really good. I want to talk about the SDGs because I had the honor and to participate in the negotiations of the 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals in New York in 2015 when they were adopted. I just want to talk a little bit about the importance of the SDGs. There's a close link to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted by 48 countries. This agreement was adopted by 195 countries, including the two observer countries of United Nations, the Vatican State and Palestine, which does not make it easier. But just to get 195 countries around the table to talk about something so fundamental as the future of our planet, a recipe for where to go in the next, now just 12 years. It's a major achievement that really has to be celebrated. And I think if we manage to get closer to realizing the SDGs, then we will also get much closer to realizing the aspirations of Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So I think it's something that we really have to bear in mind. I see it as a contract between us and our children, between us as humans on this side of the planet with humans on the other side of the planet. So for that reason, it's really, really important. So when Denmark participated in these negotiations, we had defined a clear strategy in advance. We wanted to build on some of our comparative advantages and bring them to the forefront. So we had identified gender equality, a very important human rights issue also, as one of the issues where we felt we had a comparative advantage, where we had something to show for it. We wanted to talk about peace, we wanted to talk about energy and climate, and then about partnerships. And those issues became the future goals 5, 7, 13, 16, and 17. And what we did was that we put our full society behind achieving those aspirations for the future agenda. So we put our experiences with gender equality, we put our experiences with energy and climate, we put our experiences in working with peace in the United Nations to the table, and we tried to engage ourselves where it was possible to use all the tools in our diplomatic toolbox as a small state. And negotiating the SDGs was multilateralism at its best. It was a General Assembly discussion, of course, so it was a place where we had the opportunity as a small state to sit at the table, even as a small country. And since it was also a 3-year process, there were lots of opportunities for small countries to influence, to contribute, to provide think pieces, to organize seminars, and as such contribute to this discussion. I had the honor also to facilitate discussions in the Commission on Population and Development, where we discussed sexual and reproductive health and rights, another very important part of the whole discussion on women's and girls' rights. And we achieved something in that discussion, and later on contributed also to the final goal 5 in the SDGs. So that was my short story. Thank you.
Actually, the sexual rights issue is very important today as we think of the Nobel Peace Award laureates today who are receiving their award. So landmines, sustainable development goals. Raimonda, what do you have to
Good
say?
morning. I'll be referring to our UN experience because, as you know, as my host today, Estonia is certainly running for UN Security Council, and they're doing a fantastic job from what I've seen in New York. A country that is constantly punching above its weight in various ways. And I hope to see Estonia on the Security Council because, again, from our own experience, we can tell that small countries can make a difference. It's all relative, though. You know, sometimes you make a difference without making a difference, as paradoxical as it is. Speaking out simply for what's right. We were pushed into the foreground during our term on the UN Security Council because of Ukraine's situation, because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and annexation of Crimea, and we became natural spokeswomen for Ukraine and for our neighbors on the UN Security Council. It's not something you want. You know, I'd rather not be as outspoken and visible and, you know, punching them our waist simply because I'd rather see peace and stability and no Russians on Ukraine's soil. But that was the case. We saw the little green men coming in, and we know what happened. So Lithuania stepped in, and we did a lot of work in focusing Security Council's work on what's happening with our neighbor and friend to the east. By itself, Lithuania, I think, wouldn't have been able to do that, even as much as we've tried. And what matters, I think, in being able to make a difference is coalition building. You have to have the right kind of coalition. You have to have like-minded countries working with you. And as a coalition, you raise your own voice. You add your own weight to that joint voice, and that's how we make a difference, I think. Also, a very clear prioritization. As small countries, we cannot do everything on Earth. We cannot engage on every single issue as much as we want, simply because we have fewer resources. Again, having your priorities very clear and working those priorities matters a lot. And I think for us, certainly Ukraine and the situation in and around Ukraine because of Russia's invasion was very important. We also used the occasion to speak for Georgia, for our other neighbors who are also under Russia's attack. And I think we've done quite well not judging by the outcome, because Ukraine is still struggling. Ukraine is still, you know, being attacked, as sad as it is. But we managed to withstand a lot of pressures from other neighbors of ours, big neighbors. And one of the most satisfying moments for me personally was seeing the then Russian ambassador complain to the press about the indefatigable Lithuanians who were messing up all of their plans. We managed to, you know, we've struggled, but we managed to push forward the right kind of discourse and explain the situation and bring in Ukrainian voices, Crimean Tatars in particular, because again, that can be very easily neglected and overlooked, and it was not easy to put them on a Security Council agenda itself, but we used other kinds of formula, para-Security Council formats, the so-called ARIA formula and others, to bring in Crimean Tatars so that they can tell their story themselves. And I think that matters, because when you hear the voices from the ground, when you hear the voices of the people who've been through all of the horror of losing their homes and oppression and all of that, it does make a difference. That's one huge area which took a lot of our work. I think, personally for me, another area of our engagement was very important. We did push forward the agenda for the protection of journalists in conflict. We managed to produce a resolution 2222, which became a landmark issue and was later used in other international bodies, OSCE, Council of Europe, UNESCO, as a point of reference on the protection of journalists in conflict. And also established group of friends, which groups of friends are quite common at the end for those who know it. But for us, it was specifically the protection of journalists in conflict and setting up a group of friends in New York first, which then expanded again into other international headquarters. Now we have similar groups of friends in Vienna, in Paris, in Geneva. And I think it's very important because, again, you know, journalists managed to draw attention to ongoing conflicts, to venture into the worst of the situations, the hellholes of the world, to inform us and to focus on what matters, including human rights abuses, atrocities, and all of that. Without this information, I think you know, it would be a lot more difficult to mobilize the international community to step in and try to protect the rights, try to defend the most vulnerable. And therefore, you know, seeing the role that journalists play in these situations was very important, and we worked on that.
How did it actually evolve that you became the main advocate for Ukraine? Did it you just reacted to the events that took place, or because there were many other countries also? Again, you know, in our region we have particular relationships, very, very special relationships, historic ties, but also neighborhood, you know, policies and all of that. And I think what matters is not just the current ties, but also the history. We've been through that. We've been through occupation. We've been through, you know, horrible years of captivity. And seeing a neighbor being attacked, seeing a neighbor being, you know, eaten up bit by bit, piece by piece, is terrifying to think. You know, what happened with Ukraine, what happened with Crimea is the most blatant violation of UN Charter for that matter. Russia, as one of the 5 permanent members, is supposed to be the custodian of the UN Charter, more than anybody else, because these 5 countries have exclusive rights. And that's one of the 5 countries violating the very charter it's supposed to defend. And again, we can all very easily imagine what would follow next. You know, if they do that and they go, you know, unpunished, and we remember the story of 2008, when Georgia was attacked, you know, nothing happened. Yes, there was some, you know, response of the international community, and the response was obviously inadequate. And then, you know, Russia gets emboldened by what happens, by the lack of response, by the lack of clear stance, by the lack of pushing back. So it eats up another piece of another country, and that keeps going on. So do we want to find ourselves in a situation like this? I think it's a natural thing that we stand up for our neighbors, because we can easily imagine, you know, the scenarios that might follow if the pushback doesn't happen again. Okay, and now we're to Paul, whom I accidentally demoted to Vice Undersecretary, who's actually the Undersecretary for Political Affairs at the Estonian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. You're a good example of making Estonia matter.
Thank you, Evelyn. The titles are not important here. I think we all are talking on our own behalf more than from the official talking points. Raimonda's point was very, very important, that how Lithuania was able to speak up in favor of Ukraine in the UN Security Council. Would like to underline that this was possible only mostly because Lithuania was member of UN Security Council at the time. So all eyes were on you. You were one of the 15 in the council. And when you came up from the council room, you had all audience who wanted to hear your thoughts because you were one of those who were discussing this behind the closed doors as well. So that's why we are also willing to run for the UN Security Council. It's important that from our region, like-minded countries would be in the council. Just to, when situations like these happen, that we can be there, the ones who speak up. I think that, and we all have rather pessimistic view on the developments in the European security in the foreseeable future. Russia is not going to change their behavior, despite our principles. Ukrainian crisis can continue, so we have to be alert, whatever is happening there. During my own career, that has been like for 20 years or so, I have encountered human rights issues in various stages. In the very beginning of 2000s, I was working in a team that was aiming to close down the OSCE mission here in Tallinn. We still had this here, that kind of monitoring of the human rights issues in Estonia, and we were pretty much on the defensive by this time. We had to explain to everybody that we are living up to all the international norms and standards. Today, I would rather say that we are the advocates of the human rights. We are having an active stance in the world arena. When speaking about small states in the global arena, from all these three presentations, I pick very important principle that a small state has to develop a niche capability, has to develop a specific, ideally a specific area of competence, and only through that you can be really visible and effective. In Estonia's case, we have been more focusing on some of the issues where everybody almost knows that Estonia is a front runner, and this is the digital field, freedom online, by the way, freedom on the internet, because there is always this conflict of preventing bad things happening on the internet, like terrorism or child pornography, and then the freedom to express itself on the internet. So we are advocating for the principle that whatever is prohibited in the real life, like terrorism, should be also prohibited on the internet, but whatever is allowed in the real life should also be allowed on the internet, including freedom of opinion. Cyber security, international law, support for rules-based international order, and we can discuss it later on, what does it really mean. These are, I think, the guiding principles what we would like to bring into the picture. Together with the small states, in our Security Council campaign, we try to make the point that we speak on behalf of the small states. We would like to hear the concerns of the small states, and they are very different group, very varied group of countries, from small Pacific islands until some countries that are small but actually rich, that are contributing in many ways. It's important that we come together and we kind of exchange views and discuss, and UN is perfect format to have this kind of debates, I think.
Thanks. Also, one important disclaimer I forgot before, because I was just so excited to be on the stage myself. All those 4 diplomats, they are speaking on their own behalf, not on behalf of any institutions, although I would assume they are all very well informed by certain institutions, so enlightened private people. And maybe to get a bit broader perspective, if we look at the international arena, small countries, big countries. Some small countries seem to be exceptionally visible on the stage. Maybe could you reflect on what makes some countries spectacularly successful while being really actually minor? Maybe starting from the middle again and Raimonda this time.
Thank you. And I guess I have to come back to what we already said. Very clear priorities of a country. Knowing what you want, what matters to you the most. Pooling your resources in a very clear way, in a niche, as you said. But also looking into what matters for the larger community. If you speak just for yourself, I guess, your voice won't carry too far. But if you really manage to pick out what matters to the larger community, to really the underlying principles which appeal to all of us as human beings, as societies, I think that works. Consistency also matters, because if you keep jumping from one issue to another, it won't take you anywhere. Being seen as an honest broker. Small countries tend to be seen as less, we don't have heavy histories, we don't have, a past which has imposed itself on others. So we can be seen as honest brokers, we can be seen as bridge builders in an easier way. Personalities matter too, because if you have, in a case of the UN, if you have an ambassador who has an outstanding personality, who has a very clear priority, at times that priority can become a country's priority, whichever way you look. And one case I would like to take is Liechtenstein. If you ask most of the people in the world, where's Liechtenstein? Yeah, it's somewhere in Europe, but a lot of people in the world have a hard time, putting the finger on a map where specifically it is. Some wouldn't even know it exists. But within the UN, from certain points of view, Liechtenstein seemed like a superpower on the rule of law, on accountability, on issues of justice, on issues of, what human rights. That's again leading to our today's special occasion, Human Rights Day. For example, when we talk about Security Council, once again, Liechtenstein's initiative, Code of Conduct, against the use of veto in cases of atrocities and cases of major human rights violations. That's a very basic thing, because atrocities happen, they've happened in our own histories, and Estonia's been through atrocities through occupation, we've been through atrocities through occupation, and large parts of the world today are undergoing incredible atrocities, slave markets reappearing in the 21st century with ISIS in Syria, in Iraq, the territories that were taken by ISIS. Rape as a tool of war coming back, and every single conflict in Africa, you'll find rape as a tool of war. Rohingya case, again, you look at incredible atrocities across the world, and therefore what Liechtenstein took up and proposed for the larger community within the United Nations was very important. And as a result, a tiny country managed to muster the support of well over 100 countries for the initiative. Another initiative was when the Security Council failed with Syria and the use of chemical weapons. Because of repeated Russia's vetoes protecting the Syrian regime, 12 vetoes total. Again, Liechtenstein came up with the idea of, but I have to quote the name because it's a complicated name, the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism on international crimes committed in the Syrian Arab Republic. Again, it was their initiative, a tiny country, seeking accountability, seeking to collect evidence of atrocities and crimes committed. And again, that initiative was supported by well over 100 countries. And they keep working on that, they keep mustering the finances to keep the mechanism going, to collect the evidence, so that one day, when the situation changes, those in Syria who've undergone, unspeakable horrors can expect justice to be done in their name. So again, it's a very clear focus on what they want to achieve, and rule of law for them is the key. And that's how Liechtenstein puts itself on a map. And I think that's extraordinary. But that requires, very clear focus and very dedicated, leave everything else behind and just work on that.
Well, this is an example of really altruistic behavior, putting yourself out there to serve the others. But small countries also have interests. What about those? They have also sometimes very personal, selfish, maybe interests that are connected with their own survival. What about that? What about standing up for them? I don't know. Pasi, what would you... You also, for a start, you gave a good example of Finland standing up for its own interests.
Yeah.
Of being an independent country.
Thank you, Evelyn. No, I agree with Raimonda talking about Liechtenstein. I mean, I have a similar experience with Liechtenstein when I was at the UN that they really focus, and they're pretty effective in the UN context with sort of a soft power initiatives. It helps also to have an outsized personality at the UN as an ambassador. And they had one at the time. I think she became a foreign minister afterward. Anyway, I don't know, I'm supposed to respond to your sort of a question about...
don't small countries have personal interests? Can you give maybe any examples of...
Personal interests? Well, some
they
may
are
have.
just in the service
Some may
of the
have.
general good of the world.
I also led our campaign to win a seat on the UN Security Council. Not very successful, though. But I ran into a number of countries who certainly had personal interests involved when you talk to them. But I thought I'd be saying something about, you brought up, Raimonda, you brought up Liechtenstein. I can bring up another country which I think punches above its weight. It's more sort of a hard power. Yours is sort of a soft power, Liechtenstein. But this one is really a hard power country. I'm not passing any moral judgments on this country, but it does have an impact. And I think if you look at a small country that has an impact, regional impact, even global impact. And the country I'm talking about is Israel. I was ambassador there for 5.5 years, so I have some personal experience about the country. And it's small. You all know Israel is small geographically speaking. It's a sliver of Finland if you compare. And in terms of population, maybe 7 million now. But it doesn't act like a small country. I would contend that Israel is a great power. It acts like one. It looks other great powers straight in the eye, expects and receives equal treatment from them. It can make its views known. It can twist the arm of the United States of America on issues that it considers vital, like Iran, for example. It lectures the EU on any number of issues. It, disregards any number of UN resolutions. There's a saying in Israel, shmum. Being United Nations in Hebrew. Sort of a dismissive attitude. The UN is against us. But they're very effective. They do make an impact. Regionally, they are superpowers. So I think that's interesting to look at a small country that really makes a difference without taking any stand in terms of
what is it? Is it the attitude, just being
I think it's where many of the people have come from, actually, in Israel. It's an immigrant country. Of course, they were the Arab population at the beginning, but many of the people who came from Germany, Britain, US, Russia. Maybe they brought their own mentality of a great power with them, but certainly that's my experience from Israel. That's what you deal with. You don't deal with a small country, you deal with a great power.
Can I jump in on this? I think talking about Israel, it's a question of how they perceive it's, a small country being faced with an existential threat constantly. And that mobilizes in a way unlike anything else. Because again, for them, I think it's the way they see it, it's a question of life and death constantly. And therefore, choosing life, you have to focus all of your efforts and do whatever it costs to make sure that you just keep on living, that you just keep thriving and existing and having your rightful place under the sun, basically. So it's, I think that's where that, persistence and courage and determination comes from, because the choice is very stark. You either exist or you don't.
And if I may, I absolutely agree. I think it's a country that focuses on one thing, basically. It's security, bitajón. That's what they do. And in that sense, it's never been a normal country, because throughout its existence, it's lived in a conflict. So the state of conflict is the normal state. So that gives it a certain focus in matters that, it really focuses on those matters that are sort of, in a way, life and death issues. So that helps concentrate your mind and helps concentrate the other's mind, and that's why it acts the way it does act. I'm not, again, morally we can speak whether Israel does right or wrong in any particular instance, but that's how great power acts.
Visible. Pauli wanted to add something.
Yeah, I wanted to add, strangely, I just from my own personal experience, I have never felt that I am representing a small country. I don't know why.
Okay, good for you.
Yes. But it's a country. It's not alone. It is having its friends and allies, partners. Our aims are clear. We put, at least try to put principles before the interests, because principles last and interest can change. It's not easy always, but it's still so. I was in The Hague maybe 6 months ago, and we had a panel there about Baltic security. Baltic security, and the title of the panel was Does Geography Matter? And before we started the panel, one person from the Middle Eastern background came to me and said that, look, geography matters a lot. Geography is everything. We in the Middle East know that. And from the realist foreign policy school thinking, that's the true. I mean, geography can determine mostly of what you have. I picked up this idea and I developed it in the panel, and in the sense that indeed I agree, but not to a fullest extent, because the international law, the rules that we have agreed in the UN or elsewhere, are meant to kind of balance the primacy of geography. So even if you are small, even if you are vulnerable, and thinking also about Ukraine and Georgia, for instance, then their defense is partly, of course, their friends, but partly also the principles. So we have to always be able to refer to the principles, and we have to always live up to that. And the problematic thing is how to enforce, because in terms of Ukraine, I see that the toolbox is somewhat limited. We are having collective security here in Estonia. We are a member of NATO. Even Finland is cooperating with NATO very actively. But as regards to the enforcement of their freedom, I feel that our hands are somewhat tied. So this is, but the small states, definition of small states in UN, maybe not everybody knows, is a country that is having less than 10 million people. So I think in the UN there are 107 countries that are in this category. So the majority in the General Assembly are small states, less than 10 million people. I served as an ambassador in Cairo, in Egypt. Egypt is having close to 100 million people, and Cairo is 20 million. Sometimes people ask me, how many people live in Estonia? And sometimes I responded, less than 10 million. And I was factually right. So they were very satisfied. They understood it's a small state.
Don't confuse people too much. Okay, but maybe staying in the region of Middle East, or referring to Europe as well, Liechtenstein and Israel are clearly quite well-off countries. Jens, you have experience in Gaza. Is it possible to actually, when you look at those people, they're Palestinians, is it possible to be small, poor, and still influential, visible? How it's, because we still hear about them.
Well, if we talk about Gaza and the United Nations, you can clearly say that Gaza takes up much more space at the United Nations that the number of people living there would normally say that they should do or allow them to. It is really high on the agenda at the United Nations. So in that sense, you can say that for Gaza, the same counts for the people of Gaza as human beings, and also now as an observer state of the United Nations, that the United Nations is a guarantee for small states and for individuals as such. So, but I don't think that United Nations is really delivering anything to the people of Gaza at this time, at least not any solutions. They are helping people in Gaza. My experience in Gaza was with the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine refugees. So the United Nations is doing something for them, and the issue of Palestine is high on the agenda at the United Nations. But of course the solutions are not really there, and I think the hard security and of course also the influence of Israel is playing an important role here. Again, why is it high on the agenda at the United Nations? It's because this is an issue that cannot be handled by any one country alone. While Israel is doing well economically, security-wise, the problem is not solved. There's still an issue. There's an issue on the Israeli northern border. There's an issue on the border to Gaza. So this is still brewing, and Israel, I believe, cannot solve this alone. We need an international solution to solve this. So in that sense, the United Nations is a guarantee for small peoples or peoples who are not really represented elsewhere.
But what's the best strategy for small countries? Should it be more like sticking together with other small ones, or maybe with Israel's case, we also see that actually they also benefit a lot from the US, especially nowadays, but also beforehand, that they have the big sponsors, so to say. What's the best strategy? Would it be seeking alliances with other small countries for the sake of them feeling small, like a small country as well? Or would it be better to seek if you can swim in the tailwind of a big country?
Well, I think it's a little bit different if you talk about hard security issues and if you talk about softer policy issues. So my claim to fame on this issue is that I wrote this paper a few years back on how small states can leverage their power at the United Nations. It was primarily focused on the Second Committee and the General Assembly, but we do also mention the example of Liechtenstein really achieving something on the issue of Security Council agenda. But alliances is of course important at the United Nations. It's incredibly important. This United Nations is world politics. It's just in one place often. So it's about alliances, it's about promoting your interests, and then ultimately it's about convincing others that your interest is also their interest. If you achieve to do that, then you can achieve something. So alliance building at the United Nations, you also talk about a group of friends. If you can build an alliance that is, maybe you can base it on Nordic-Baltic cooperation to begin with. We have shared interests, we have shared values. But if you can get somebody around the table who represent also the Latin American group, who represent the African group, who represent the Asian group, then you're beginning to build a consensus that is needed to achieve, a General Assembly resolution that normally requires total consensus among 195 countries. So it is just normal politics. It's just concentrated very much in New York City often. I just want to get back to the example of Estonia. You mentioned what Estonia has been doing in e-government. And I think it's quite impressive. In my job, a part of my job is also to work with technology in development cooperation. And wherever we go and talk about what Denmark can do, people keep mentioning Estonia. And Estonia has been doing this, and Estonia is here and there, and they have e-identity, and they have been really successful. We go to Kenya and we try to talk about what Denmark can propose, and people say Estonia. So I think that's quite impressive. And I think what Estonia has, what you say, Paul, is that a niche has been defined. Estonia didn't have a heritage on this issue, so you could build something, you could leapfrog development a little bit and start from new. And then you had put that comparative advantage to your own advantage. And then you have taken it a step further, you have invested. It's also a whole of government and a whole of society approach to this issue. I was also in Brussels discussing Digital for Development, which is DEFCO's, the European Commission Development Arm's work on digital development. They also said, well, we are working with Estonia on this issue. So just to say that as a small country, if you put your comparative advantage as a part of your politics, you can really achieve something and make a name of for yourself. So congratulations on that.
It's good, you started.
Thank you, Jens, for
Okay,
mentioning
Paul
that.
and then Pasi.
Thank you, Jens, for mentioning that. I really feel in this particular field that there we can reach our limits, because the demand globally is so big for this kind of advice and services. And the people are numbered in Estonia, so we have, and there is where we have to cooperate and find kind of trilateral cooperation formats with the others, like we are having with Organization of American States in order to cooperate on this e-governance in the Caribbean. So we are pooling with some other countries. I'm not doing myself very actively UN security campaign trips because I'm having other duties in the ministry. But sometimes I go and meet people and explain Estonia's bid to UN Security Council. Interestingly, meeting in Washington people from Dominican Republic, I introduced them with this e-governance and cybersecurity agenda, and then they said, but we have already had 4 delegations from Estonia. So, I mean, we kind of reaching out. It's not only diplomats. There are other guys who are doing this job. But we are really reaching out quite far. And that's great. That's one niche.
And
there
of
can be
course
others.
that is good for your Security Council candidature also. So while you do something in a field that is not very closely related to security, just to be out there and take international responsibility, contributing internationally, I think that's extremely positive for your candidature.
If I may comment just very briefly on what would be the common denominator of all small states, I said, more than 100. Like Liechtenstein is having 37,000 people, but very rich. There are countries in Pacific that are poor and very vulnerable. The climate change and everything that can have an impact. But there is one common denominator, I think, that is uniting all of us, and this is our desire that the international law, rules-based international system would exist and would thrive. And this is where I think we find common ground. So how can we enforce the rules? Which is basically, the rules means in the UN thinking, how to curb the big ones, how to restrict the big ones from behaving as they wish. And one can have different alliances, but still I think the big ones have always tendency to kind of prevail, to enforce their own opinions or policies. And it's not always not positive, so we have to kind of try to balance it. We can try to balance it in a smaller groups, or there is a forum of small states in UN, but there is always this kind of necessity, not to let the big ones go and run widely.
Pasi, Raimond, you wanted to comment
Yes,
as well?
I agree with Paul about the importance of maintaining the rule-based international system. It's of course in our interest as a as a small state. I mean, we need to have rules. We need to have predictability in the international system. That's very, very important. We don't like surprises or the law of the jungle. You know what happens in the jungle. The prey tends to be small, so we don't want that. But in terms of, you know, talking about, I think we started off in terms of the Security Council campaign mode. I agree very much with what Jens said about sort of the niche idea, and I think Estonia has a wonderful niche in e-government, and even that's important, or that is more important, I think, in terms of the Security Council campaign than the abstract notions of a rule-based international system. I mean, really, when you're one-on-one with countries, small countries that are very small, very poor sometimes, you know, the internet is important to them, and what you have there is important. And I remember we had a ministerial visit to Australia when I was ambassador to Australia, a joint visit by the Estonian Foreign Minister Marina Kaljurand and our Foreign Minister Timo Soini. And I felt rather envious that Marina was sort of explaining the e-government concept and handing out these e-government, these e-passports or whatever around. And, you know, she was really outshining Timo Soini, which is not easy to do. But she did that. So you really have a good thing going there. And I would, if I were running your campaign, but don't take any advice from me. I mean, I lost the campaign. But I would really concentrate on that particular niche, what you can do. Instead of talking so much about high principles, I think we did a bit too much of that, because that gets under the skin of some people. You know, they look at the Nordics and maybe also Baltics, can look at us as sort of preachy, you know, and that's not good. I mean, I think we don't want to give that impression that we sort of always know the best or know best. But really concentrate on strengths, and I think e-government and everything you do with internet and cybersecurity and things, that's your thing, and you should really, because that's what you do anyway. You know, you can't invent things for the Security Council campaign. You're and you go with what you have.
A couple of points, perhaps unrelated between themselves. We have to be careful with words, because, again, if on a Security Council campaign you say poor countries, then you lose those countries for sure. Nobody likes to be poor. Nobody likes to be, you know, cold poor. We have all kinds of terms for that, but we have to be sensitive. You know, in the UN speak, you have least developed countries, least developed countries, landlocked, least developed countries, all kinds of crazy stuff. that's what we, that's what we deal with. But as a whole, I think you referred to the Pacific Island states. Again, when it comes to existential threats, I think even the most vulnerable countries can play a role. And I think the Pacific Island states is a case in point on climate change. If you think about the negotiations leading to the Paris Agreement, the Pacific Island states have been incredibly active and busy and got their voice heard. And when you look at the numbers, you know, Palau has 23,000 population, you know, Nauru has 13,000 population. Still, they participated in negotiations in a very systematic, very active way. Again, putting everything aside, because that's, you know, for them, again, is a question of life and death. Kiribati is sinking already. You know, Kiribati is buying land in Fiji just in case seas keep rising and have to evacuate. Nauru is losing soil because of salinization. Water keeps coming up, and they can't, you know, sow their own crop anymore. Again, so these are existential threats, and when you're faced, you know, you're back against the wall in terms of existential threats, you do find your voice no matter how poor and how small you are. In terms of closer to home, I think I was, you know, I didn't mention Georgia before, but again, looking at the UN context, when Russians attacked Georgia and, you know, carved out a piece of the country, they put up a resolution at UN on displaced persons in Georgia. The first vote, I think they got 17 votes yes, 16 votes again. That's how the first resolution passed more than 10 years ago. they've been working in an incredible way. Again, traveling around the world, investing in relationships with individual countries. And over that period of time, they managed to grow. It's still not a perfect, it's still below 100. But now out of these 17 voices that supported Georgia at the time, they now have close to 90 votes in favor of their resolution. That's a persistence, that's a systematic approach to what matters to you most. And I think if we all look at, our life and death situations, we all find the right kind of voice, we all find the right kind of means, because that, goes well above everything else. And I think in our case, yes, we're free to, because we have the NATO umbrella, we have the EU, we're free to act, but, I think why we try to punch above our weight from time to time, I think is exactly that. Because in the back of our mind, we know that we are on that cusp where things can change very easily, and we don't have the certainty. We don't have the privilege and the luxury of sitting back and doing the very general, issues. We have to look out for ourselves, no matter what we do. Building our name, building our, renommee around the world, but at the same time, taking care of the basics, and the basics is our security. Small and, how we deal. I'm always a little bit skeptical about huddling up just for the sake of being small. There are practical aspects to working together as small countries, but at the same time, we represent different values, we represent different systems. And I would never advocate for, pooling up together just because we're small. What matters, and you were referring to rules-based, that's one thing, but also our values and our principles. We cannot give up, the values and principles that we stand for, because the erosion is happening. If we look at the democratic world, democracy is shrinking around the world. Every single study these days is saying that democracy is shrinking. Therefore, I think for me, what matters the most is not the size of a country. The size doesn't, define us. You were right. We feel, we act as we feel, and if we feel big, we act big, and that's it. We cannot go back to that, smallness aspect all the time, because it's a limitation up to a point, because if you start thinking small, you end up being small. We have to create coalitions. We have to work with like-minded countries, and I think the best results come when you have a mix of big and small based on the same value system.
Yeah, I think Raimonda is right on the money there. I mean, there's no such thing as automatic small state solidarity per se. I think it needs to be, it can happen, but there needs to be other things like, shared values and others. And so that's more important than smallness is as such is not a political attribute. It's just, size attribute. Nothing more than that. Can be important, but I mean, you mentioned the Pacific Island states, the PSIDS, small, what's it called? Small
Island developing states.
Island developing states. Yeah, right. They're small, but the more important thing for them actually is that they're island states and they're developing. I mean, these countries, if you call them countries, very small, I mean, they're extremely isolated geographically, and they're vulnerable to the weather events, especially now with climate changes as well. So they have an issue on which they can agree, and they are pretty effective in the UN context. Although I must say I'm pretty pessimistic about them I've visited all of them actually, been to Kiribati too, and the problem in Kiribati is actually overpopulation, erosion and overpopulation. I mean, this place will be uninhabitable long before climate change does anything, because there are too many people, there's no sanitation, they dig up the sand and cause erosion, so it's one hell of a mess, the place. But of course they bring out people like, so as a country I don't think it's influential, it's in that particular context they have come in. So, and I think you've asked at some point that whether a small and a poor country can be influential. I don't think it can really, except sort of joining together with other small countries. You can make a difference in the UN context, and you can make, but individually they can. I mean, this reminds me of the Kiribati president. I think he may still be president, Anot Tong, who's been very, very visible on the climate change circuit. So that can happen, but as such, not really.
One good thing that Ramonda already mentioned, and also it came up in the first discussion before our panel, or countries or leaders can agree on some noble goals, like we should do something against climate change. And as we saw in the case of France, French president actually started taxing fuel to convince people use less polluting cars, and it all brought up riots on the streets. Now he has had to backtrack to an extent already. We see all sorts of populist movements all around the world. Do you think what about the international climate? How supportive is that currently towards advancing noble goals? Jens, you have been quite quiet for a while, so shoot.
Okay, so I get a hard question. But I think, of course, I think there's no question that our noble causes are under pressure. Coming back to the small states, we do have one thing in common, and I think you said it, we need a system to persist, because if it doesn't persist, we are in a jungle, and we are going to lose. But I think for those big countries that we think, and who may think they don't need this system, they do need this system as much as us, because our world is increasingly multilateral, if you ask me. The questions that we discuss are increasingly multilateral. Of course, we still have hard security issues, but many of the issues on the global agenda, and many of the issues that come up at the UN can only be solved at that level. Okay, sorry. I hope
You're
you
forced to use
I hope you could hear my inspiring talk anyway. No, so many of these issues can only be solved there. I think at the Global Peace Forum in Paris, Guterres, he mentioned technology, climate change, and migration as three of the main issues on the global agenda these days. So what is the agenda for Russia to deal with this? What is the agenda for USA to deal with this? You know, they cannot deal with it alone, as we cannot deal with it alone. So I believe that even those countries, they need to engage in these multilateral discussions to solve these issues. So we may have trouble now, but as you also said, 107 states are small at the UN. We need this system. When it comes, when push comes to shove, what you say, then I think even the big states will again come back in the fold and realize that they also need this system to solve our problems.
If I may, I sense that something is changing, particularly in Europe, also in America, for different reasons perhaps. That this kind of multilateral global cooperation is not necessarily seen always as a good thing. So there is a shift of mentality, and it's difficult to say why it is so. Maybe because of the information space is changing itself. That people say we have to stick to our identities, and everything that is kind of global can be threatening to us. So, and particularly if you take the UN documents, like you said, you cannot say poor, you have to say least developed or least developed. And it's difficult to understand what you're talking. So it sounds like a kind of globalist mumbo jumbo. But we still have to make the case to our people that this kind of cooperation is important, because alone it's difficult to solve. And this poses a particular challenge, not to the diplomats, because we know what we are talking about, but for the politicians mostly, I think.
Yeah, Jens.
No, maybe just on human rights being under pressure, and we're talking today about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I think what we have achieved very much is our civil and political rights in many parts of the world, but maybe we are lagging very much on the other rights, on the social and economical rights. And that may be part of the reason that we have this populist backlash today also. If you look at the inequality in the world today, it's as it was before the First World War. That's a recipe for catastrophe. And if we don't address that, and that means if we don't actually look at what it says in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and in the SDGs, if I may again, then we may fail. And I think that is something we have to be very much aware of, that we are not really realizing the human rights before we also realize the social and economical rights.
Well, yeah, you didn't want, okay.
I think, you referred to information space. We're bombarded by information. Sometimes it's hard to distinguish what's right, what's fake, what's God knows what. But at the same time, we know so much more about the world. 50 or 60 years ago, if a conflict started, there was a conflict somewhere there. But that's about it. Now we see pictures of disasters, of tragedies, of deaths, in real life. And I think that exacerbates the discussion on the multilateral institutions as a whole. We see multilateral institutions much more as failing than as succeeding. Because, you've had Syria war, and it's been developing on the ground, but it's been developing on the internet and everywhere else. There's this immediate image of, beheadings by ISIS, or a Jordanian pilot being burnt to death in a cage, or, Rohingyas again, lining up, trying to get out of the country, being burned, being raped, and all of that. We're bombarded by that information. And the impression is that, the UN is failing, international organizations are failing. They're failing in some cases, not only an impression, they're failing because the scope of conflicts and troubles is huge. When you look at, for example, urgent humanitarian assistance, if you had 1 or 2 or 3 conflicts, you could, figure out how to finance support. Now you have 15 or 16 conflicts simultaneously. And the terrifying thing is that, for example, situation in Yemen or situation in Central African Republic, when you have these appeals for humanitarian assistance, the amount of money collected is at 10% of the actual need. What can you do with 10% when people are starving? And you're seeing these pictures of starving children, again, on the internet right in front of you. And that links to the need for reform. I think it's a legitimate question how good we are at reforming the multilateral system as a whole. I mean, I worked in New York for 2 terms, different terms, and I've been through 2 major reform agendas. 2005, when the then Secretary General Kofi Annan took up, and then, between the 2 SGs leading to Secretary General Guterres. Major reform agendas, fantastic documents lined up, what needs to be done to improve the multilateral system. How much is being done is another question. And therefore, I think for the international community, particularly those who are in trouble, who are undergoing a crisis, a disaster, the international community never does enough. And that undermines the legitimacy of the organizations. That, deceives us because the expectations are not met. And that, I think, again, undermines the support for the multilateral system in a way. It's not the only factor, but it's one of the many factors, I think.
Well, just briefly.
Very briefly, I think the beauty of internet is also that you can illustrate whatever piece of news with whichever photo or video. The same migration issue has been always illustrated by people climbing over the fences. And the fact that in 2015 we had 1.8 million asylum seekers in Europe, and this year we have only 90,000, it's kind of disappearing. Nobody's talking about it. It's always kind of being portrayed as a 2015 situation. I would say that I'm relying more and more on the information from what I'm getting from my embassy network than from anybody else, because there are people who are reliable, at least in my eyes, who are reporting to me what is happening. Like 10 years ago, I was thinking, well, we are having internet, so we don't need embassies anymore. We can all look on the internet and see what is happening. But it's not anymore so. Internet is a domain of information warfare, and that's it.
The big elephant in the room, which I want all of you to reflect on. Today, our president is not attending the summit in Marrakesh. All of our countries are now not signatories, but countries who have agreed with the UN Migration Compact. In 2 of the countries represented here on the stage, although people are not representing the countries but themselves, but still from their countries. It went fairly flawlessly. In 2 countries, especially in Estonia, it took a more emotional turn than any, I think, political event in recent decade or so. Yeah, we have already more than 10 years from bronze riots, so yeah. So what went wrong with that migration compact? Why aren't several European countries agreeing with it? Why did it cause such an uproar? Who wants to start? You all grew quiet on that. Pasi, yes, you seem like you have ideas.
Thank you. I don't know much about the Global Compact on Migration. I speed read it this morning, 34 pages. You're right, in my country, Finland, there wasn't much of a discussion. There was some discussion in Parliament, but the government never brought it to Parliament. It was sort of during question time, so there was some unease expressed about that, and will be in Marrakesh. I think our minister or somebody will be there. Just speed reading the thing, what struck me was that I didn't find a sort of a clear distinction between economic migrants and political refugees. I mean, it's all migration, 360 degrees or whatever. So I think that's something that probably in some countries, maybe we're sort of a slow learner, so may happen in our country too, that has caused some unease. I understand that it's seen, although it's not a treaty. I mean, it's not an international treaty or anything like that. It's basically a declaration, I think, a glorified UN resolution, if you will. But I think there's some unease in that, even though it's not that, and people are telling that it's not a treaty, don't worry, and all that. But it's a painstakingly negotiated document. I know Paul knows more about it than I do, definitely. But the fact that, and I'm old enough to remember that there was a UN resolution, just a General Assembly resolution, non-binding, just a resolution, zillions of those since, that sort of set the target of 0.7% for development aid cooperation. I mean, it's not a treaty, it's non-binding, as I said, it's just one resolution from way back. But it sort of has come as a standard to which one refers as if it were a commitment, as if it were a legally binding commitment, which it's not, but it's come. So I think there's some unease. People seem to see that this will sort of turn into something more that it will be turned nationally in each country into some sort of a new legal obligations. And I think the problem there is this unclear distinction between economic migrants and political refugees.
Paul.
There is, thank you, there is distinction because this is about migration. There is another compact for the refugees as well. This is about what we should do in order to help the UNHCR. So this is about it. The problem is that it's difficult to understand the text, the nature of it, first of all. And we are not very UN literate collectively. We don't quite understand what is being written and why it is so. This is part of the problem. We are treating the UN documents often as if they are European Union directives, which they are not. So we have to distinguish here. I think the important tenet there is also that that this document has been negotiated amongst 192 states. US from the very beginning said they are not going to participate, partly because of this was the Obama's initiative. Okay, and this is what you can achieve in the UN. If it would develop into something else, something more, then it would have another consensus around it. So I think we are quite at the very lowest common denominator on migration. The only practical effect of this document is that we are going to have the Global Migration Forum after every 4 years, and the ministers of foreign affairs will be gathering after every 2 years to take stock, where we stand on migration. Basically, that's it.
Okay.
But of course, it raises lots of questions because of this very European experience of 2015.
Raimonda, it went well in Lithuania.
It went, but I haven't followed, so I can't really comment on
It went so well that you didn't notice.
It didn't, because there was a political discussion, and there were the same concerns that have been raised in other European countries. But I remember when the whole thing started in New York, I find a certain difficulty, not because, we all migrate. 200,000 Lithuanians are in the UK and Ireland, That's the reality of modern days, and we've lost population in the last 25 years since the borders opened, so it's not, black and white thing. But I think what happened was this incredible wave of migration from the Middle East, the Syria conflict, the Libya, and all of that, where, a different culture, clash of civilizations, as somebody was saying, all of a sudden, we're overwhelmed, and as you rightly said, the numbers have changed, but we're still stuck in that particular image of a few years ago. But also the manipulation of migration. I remember at one stage from the Kremlin discourse, oh, if you don't do this and that, we'll add up to the serious situation, and there'll be more migrants coming your way. Some forces, I think, around Europe know very well that migration is a divisive issue, and they're manipulating and they're playing with that. And we have to be very careful, because if we allow Putin or anybody else, to open the floodgates of migration or close the floodgates of migration in accordance to how we, obey his ambitions, that's a major danger, because we're playing his game. That's one thing. The other thing is going back to countries of origin, I think, and that's what, what I remember from the very first discussions we had in New York, when, in the first and foremost, my question was, what are the countries of origin doing? Because a lot of these people are migrating because of corruption, because of the major injustices and all of that. Why do those very governments whose people are running away because there's just total disaster at home, they insist that Europeans should receive the migrants? Why don't we insist with equal force that they should take care of the situation back home, that they should deal with corruption, that they should deal with abuse of power, that they should deal with a situation which pushes people out? And that was not a question. You can't raise that question because, again, with all of these political correctnesses and everything, you can't raise that issue. But I think there are so many sides of the story, and the fact that, we're not strong enough on tackling corruption, on tackling abuse of power in certain regions, in certain countries specifically, I think makes part of the discourse. And that's why it's so difficult, because we Europeans are seeing on the receiving end, and everybody can point fingers saying, you have to receive. And I think, again, because it's a Human Rights Declaration Day, we have to do what we have to do. There's no doubt about it, and everybody's born equal. But we have to have a discourse. You just can't disconnect migration from the factors that cause that migration in certain situations.
Okay. Jens, and then Paul. And then Pasi.
Thank you. Is it working? Yeah. I think you're right. This discussion in New York is really difficult because there is a lot of political correctness. Mm-hmm. There are many issues that you cannot really raise. But I think the trouble we've had with the declaration is, one, there's a lack of confidence among populations, among many people, not just extremists, or how to call them, that the politicians are not able to handle this issue. I think this declaration is an attempt to try to handle it, and it's an acknowledgement that it is a broader problem than just what happens on the border. It is actually an issue of development also. Then I think there's been a lot of misinformation about this declaration, because if you read in some areas of the internet, it is presented as something that will open the gates for floods of Africans to come into Europe, which is not at all the case. First of all, it underlines national sovereignty. It underlines that states have to take back their citizens. It underlines that this is to curb irregular migration and facilitate regular migration. So I think it's a mix of those things that have made this very difficult. So our Prime Minister, it became suddenly a big issue in Denmark also. Our Prime Minister went, not on TV, he went on Facebook the other day, and he spoke for 16 minutes to the people who had been discussing this on Facebook. And he tried to argue why this is a good idea for Denmark and why it's important to have these international agreements. And he is himself today in Marrakesh to participate in this meeting.
Okay, Paul.
Very briefly, I agree, Raimonda, that there are problems in the countries of origin, why people are moving, including why people are moving from Estonia to some other European countries, but the compact is not so much about it. When there will be follow-up meetings of Marrakesh document, we have to put, of course, these issues on the table. You and me and maybe the Danes and somebody else. So this should be part of the follow-on discussion. Even if the document itself is not reflecting it properly, I should say. But the document is it's just the beginning of a dialogue within the UN. It's not the end. We have to understand that.
Pasi, short comment you wanted to make.
Yeah, sure. So the compact is only about irregular or regular immigration, or in fact legal or illegal. Yeah, fine. Okay, it's good to have dialogue always, but I mean, a couple of points. You referred to the fact that in terms of Europe, the numbers are way down, I mean, from 2015, of course, but there's no solution per se. The numbers could go up next year or the year after, unless we set our systems right in Europe and nationally. So that's still a big worry for many people, I'm sure, that this could happen, that somehow, you know, because we had this incident on the Russian border where the Russians opened the border and we suddenly got 1,500 people, just like that. So that's a worry. Secondly, countries of origin. I mean, the responsibility of the countries of origin. I think that's a very important issue. We're still stuck, in our case, with a lot of asylum seekers, Iraqis in particular, who've received who have not been accepted as refugees, and you know, as a court order that they should leave. But the problem is that in the case of Iraq, for example, they don't accept back their citizens, even if they have valid passports and whatnot. So we are stuck in a sense that these people are illegally now in Finland, but we can't send them back to the countries of origin. And I think this is something which is also an issue and can become a bigger issue. We have elections in the spring ourselves. You have in March, we have in April. So I think we should be sensitive to the concerns of people. I mean, it's not just extremists who sort of have raised some issues, have some unease at what's going on. And I think it needs to be better explained what it is instead of what it's not, this compact.
Okay, would you like to take like 2 questions from the audience, or? Okay, 1 and 2, okay. Here, and make it just 1-sentence question, and then we'll have a brief answer because we're running out of time.
Thank you. My name is Anneli Rigas. I'm a journalist for 30 years. In 90s worked at the United Nations mission here as information and coordination officer. Just a small note about this migration. People are very angry because the author of this Migration Pact, Mr. Peter Sutherland, actually said already many years ago that we need migrants to this Europe because we need more people to keep up the life standard, and one nation countries are kind of outdated. But the reason why I wanted to speak is that we get a very, very rosy picture here. I want to tell you that today is, as it's the big United Nations Human Rights Day. Estonian biggest and oldest human rights organization had to close its doors this year because it was the government reaction for taking several human rights violations to the European Human Rights Court. The organization is called Patients Union, and it's very, very sad. I want to ask Jens whether the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals program is also dealing kind of human rights in healthcare. And during this process before, this patients organization had to close all its branches in all counties and also in capital. Estonian foreign ministry actually cheated knowingly Human Rights Court. It's a very, very big and very sad thing, and I'm not speaking about this at the moment, but I want just to ask whether the United Nations is actually dealing with human rights in healthcare. Thank you.
Okay, and the second question, please make it one sentence if you want to ask it. Yeah.
I'm Ilvi Cannon from the Estonian Women's Studies and Resource Center. Happen to be a hyphenated American. I don't know if there are other Americans here. Anyway, when Ambassador Patokaljo referred to the human disaster in the Pacific Island, I'm not sure I heard clearly, but was that the Philippines you were referring to? In the context of the environmental climate changes and environmental catastrophe. But specifically, my question is, I'm old enough to remember when population explosion was a big topic universally. Has United Nations, in the midst of this migration crisis in different parts of the world, addressed the question of population explosion? It's not a problem in Estonia, as we know. We have such a shortage. But it is very critical, and it is a conflict of values, I presume, that is preventing responsible leaders of the world to address the question of population explosion. Thank you.
Okay, one question to Jens and the other one to Pasi. And
I need you to repeat the first question for me.
just with one sentence. Or
maybe you can do it.
It was about whether the UN is taking care of the human rights in healthcare. That was for you.
Human rights what?
And healthcare.
Healthcare.
Well, in the SDGs, of course, there is a health goal, and then cross-cutting part of the 2030 agenda is to leave no one behind, and that's a human rights aspect of the SDGs. It really has a focus on making sure that this time we reach those who are furthest behind. So in that sense, the SDGs addresses this question, but of course, health as a human rights issue is addressed in many other conventions and declarations and resolutions of the UN also. It's not my field of expertise, unfortunately, so I'm afraid I cannot be more precise.
okay, and Pasi, population explosion.
Well, I'm no population scientist either, but I agree with you. I think the population explosion is an issue that's behind there. And certainly in terms of this very small Pacific islands. I mentioned Kiribati. I mean, it's way overpopulated. And part of the problem is with values, as you said, because there are a lot of, they're a very Christian country. There are a lot of churches there. And the churches do not approve of any sort of family planning. And that increases the population, you know, there are no resources. So these countries face multiple threats, really. I mean, eventually climate change as well. In the short term, it's a population explosion, no sanitation, you know, tsunamis and whatnot. So in the long run, my point was that they will be uninhabitable. But the population explosion, I agree with you, is behind of many things. We need to get that under control somehow to sort of deal with many other problems.
Okay, well, thank you to all the panelists. You have been great. You didn't stop speaking, which is good. You can see that the three of you have direct UN experience, and the UN is supposed to be a great talking shop, so thank you.